I wish to share today how do we engage in God's mission in a postmodern context. I need to clarify here something. We don't have a postmodern context exclusively as such or distinctively as such. Many contexts where you still have pre-modern, modern, and postmodern people views, values, and the context exists maybe together. Maybe one is taking over the other, blended in many ways. But our purpose is to address the postmodern characteristics and issues, particularly the young people who may have such characteristics. And this would help how to engage in God's mission doing that. We also borrow this idea from various people. So there are 7 ways of doing it, but at least I highlight a few ways in the postmodern discipleship making. The first one is relational factor. Brian McLaren, of course, many people would know. He is talking about not conversions, but conversations. This mission of God need to be seen as a journey together. It's a journey of God during the Exodus to the promised land. And so it is journey of God together with people in relationship. And it's also an Emmaus journey of Jesus with his disciples, in which conversations and relations matter, the journey in which each other understand rather than impose our meanings, because God given freedom and choices and the decisions and the motives are all part of the image of God that every human beings have. And so in that journey, we also engage in a way like God to enable them to understand the meaning and purpose of life together with God's presence and in search for truth. So in that sense, the relationship matters a lot. And relational dance can be a metaphor for evangelism. We don't have the winning thing. We don't have a losing, or we don't have a conquest mentality. I don't even claim to be superior, even if you offer our best experience to others. And so in that sense, the meanings are available among the many other meanings in the market of meanings through our relations. So this journey together in that relations is very important. So the relationship in the church becomes more important than becoming even a member of the church. And so in that sense, the belonging precedes becoming, where we are also looking at how do we include people in understanding them, in recognizing them, in appreciating them, in developing the possible meanings together and sharing our stories as part of God's story, and enabling them to understand and journey together in their own way, in their own stories. So people don't become disciples at the start. Rather, they belong, relate to each other. So I come to the church and I relate to you, and then I may come to believe and journey together. So it's also important. Second factor is a narrative factor, which is more like sharing the stories, sharing our stories as part of God's stories, what God has done, how God has called us, how God is engaging with us as part of sharing narrative with others. Understanding that the narratives do not have very objective claims, or our narratives are not the meta-narratives or the grand narratives. So it is important that our stories are shared as part of their stories, and their stories are listened to. Listening is very important, and their experience of spirituality is to be listened in possible ways. And then we both learn together how God's story unveils itself in our stories. And also we understand God's story as part of our journey. The gospel must be presented in the story form much more than a set of facts, rules, and rational prepositions, or even laws to be imposed on. So the Bible itself has God speak to us via prophets, poets, philosophers, priests, and narrators. And that type of narratives are wide range, and it's very important. Early Christians and even those who put together the four gospels were not unreasonable people. They know the difference. They know that there are issues of contradictions between the stories, and they are aware that these stories or sometimes don't go together, and teachings also vary. And even though they were aware of these things, yet they felt these narratives of different types had different purposes. As John says, it is all written in order that somebody may believe Jesus the Christ. And Luke reaches out to those beyond the regular group of God's chosen people, sinners, tax collectors, and even people beyond the boundaries of what is normal or accepted. And Matthew's is much more to fulfillment and even to see God's story as continued story of the Exodus, liberative, and the chosen people story. Mark just put together things. And again, Luke is also putting things in order. So these stories were put together in order that different ways of telling, different ways of narrating, even different ways of the stories being developed or put together, each one with a specific purpose or whatever differences may talk to the different context, different history, different people in different ways, so that in some ways people will find these stories meaningful to them. So in a sense, the stories can be diverse. The stories can be at times contradictory to each other, the way God engages or the way God's experience happen in our lives. But the narrative factor is not to give an objective description of what has happened. To accept the fact that that is a limitation of the narrative. Within that limitation and constraints of the narrative, we still explain how God speaks, how God engages, how God uses people to transform the world. And that's why the narrative factor becomes very important. And then the communal factor. Of course, it is very important to form the community which constructs meanings to themselves. And there is no control of meanings. There is no control of power or authority, even though the power and authority are at its service. The leader is at the service of everyone else. And so the belonging precedes becoming, that precedes believing. The relational factor is important, but even the communal factor working together, how do you make sense of God's call, God's intervention in this world, God's continuous engagement in this world together with the difference being celebrated. It's very important that we realize why the world has different types of apples or mangoes. We engage or we eat different type of fruits, mangoes, and even within mangoes, there are different types of mangoes. Even within apples, there are different types of apples, but we eat them, not all the apples at one time, but we may eat different apples and even use apples for different purposes. But then we eat them differently because we want to increase our taste, increase the taste of life, so that the perfectness and the life in its fullness is experienced. And that's where it is coming, that communal factors can have different experiences of God. It's not to create an envy, but rather to share what God has given together and what can benefit mutually. That's where the communal factor can be very important. beyond the relational factor. And we also need to look at the process factor. We try to engage in the discipleship of journey instead of decisions, asking for people to decide, instead of following up the old methods. What we are doing is we are engaged in a process of understanding